you are here at our keynote presentation. The presentation is from Lauren Klein. Lauren is the Distinguished Research Professor and Associate Professor in the Department of Quantitative Theory and Methods and English at Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. Lauren works at the intersection of data science, AI, and the humanities with an emphasis on questions of gender and race. In the Power chapter of Data Feminism, the book she co-authored with Catherine D'Ignazio, they wrote, "Data feminism begins by examining how power operates in the world today. This consists of asking who questions about data science, who does the work and who gets pushed out, who benefits and who is neglected or harmed, whose priorities get turned into products, and whose are overlooked." Their direct attention to such questions led us to ask Lauren to speak on ethical research data, the feminist principle of examining power in the context of big data and AI. So without further delay, I give you our esteemed keynote speaker, Lauren Klein.
Jennifer, thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction. Hi to everyone. I'm calling in from Atlanta, and I was actually just remembering I've been to WashU this point a long time ago, but I see some people on the audience participant list who were instrumental in that visit. I was trying to remember I had very delicious Italian pastries. I think Joe Lowenstein might have the info on that if you're listening along. So I'm trying to transport myself over to you, even though I'm sitting in my chair. I am going to share my screen. Okay. Jennifer, look okay? Sound okay? Okay, super. So I'm going to get started. What I'm going to try to do, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to try to talk for about 35, 40 minutes, hopefully shorter than that rather than longer than that. And what I'm going to do is try to give you a little bit of background about data feminism, a little bit of the rationale that Catherine and I had for writing the book, as well as how we've seen it be transformed and sort of somewhat necessarily adapted a little as we've seen the emergence of AI enter the stage. And what I want to think about is how the principles that we wrote in 2020, but we're really thinking about, in 2018, 2019, how these principles apply to the present landscape and how they might need to be shifted a little bit to account for the sort of second reconfiguration of power in the context of AI and its development. So I'm just going to jump right in. So just to get started, we were writing the book and we were increasingly aware that data was becoming this tremendous form of power. And I think, everyone was at this point. So we were all learning from researchers whose books you see up on the screen. So Sophia Noble had at that point written Algorithms of Oppression, Virginia Eubanks, Julia Angwin, Surya Matu, Joy Bolamwini, all of these people, what all of these people in their work were pointing to was the fact that data was so powerful, but it was being wielded unequally. And more specifically, it was being wielded by this really small and homogenous group of corporations and other well-resourced institutions who had the ability to design and deploy these data and AI systems, really just for their own profit. And that usually came at the expense of everyone else. And so this is where we saw the role of feminism entering in. And what we explain in the book is how feminism and intersectional feminism in particular has been focused on precisely this, on these imbalances of power and the structural forces that cause them. That's essentially been the central project of feminism for a very, very long time. So you can think about all of these current problems and some of the language and the scenarios that are being discussed with a lot of anxiety and at times sort of existential fear right now. So people talk about the brittleness of AI systems, by which they mean systems that are or have been rather optimized for only certain situations or certain groups, but not others. Um, but the basic idea that systems are optimized for certain groups and not others, like this is not news to feminists, right? Um, or even just this idea of biased training data, which is a reality, but nevertheless seems to continually surprise developers when they produce some or they release some sort of project and or product rather, and it has biased results. This idea that biases are baked into the cultural record, this is again is sort of the ground truth of a lot of feminist work. And I'll get to the principles that we introduce in the book in a minute, but I actually wanted to back up a little bit before I get there and give you a very short introduction to feminism because I think it's really important. Because feminism means many different things to many different people. And especially, actually, if you talk about feminism in feminist circles, it's really important to define sort of what your feminism is. And so I wanted to stop before moving forward and tell you sort of what mine is. So where we start in the book with feminism is a belief in equality for all genders. This includes men and women, as well as trans and non-binary folks. But if you take a look around you, you realize that this goal of equality has not been realized in the world. And so that sort of brings us immediately to the second complementary definition of feminism, which is that it also necessarily needs to involve organized activity on behalf of women and non-binary people to make this goal of equality the reality. Um, and then feminism has this third definition, which is a set of theories and ideas. So these ideas, again, began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender, but decades and decades of scholarship, the persistent political reality have succeeded in bringing many, many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation. So these include race, obviously, class, sexuality, ability, immigration status, and more. And so this brings me up to this idea of intersectional feminism, which again, in the year 2024 is something that I think people have heard of and roughly know about. In 2020, we were all sort of learning together about the centrality of this concept. But what I want to say now is what we gain from concepts like the Combahee River Collective's formulation of interlocking systems of oppression, Kimberly Crenshaw's term intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins's idea of the matrix of domination. What all of these give us are frameworks that help structure critiques of power. So the reasons why certain people, including but not limited to women, might experience oppression on the one hand or privilege on the other. And so, what we do in the book is use the teachings of intersectional feminism, sort of bolstered with other ideas from feminist activism and feminist critical thought, to arrive at these 7 principles for doing more ethical and equitable data science. So, you can see them here. They're examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And our goal here was really to operationalize feminism for, at that point, data science. We wanted to provide a clear set of principles for people working with data, for people who wanted to work with data, including students, or for people who wanted to refuse to work with data, but to have some rationale to do so. And so what we do in the book is we have one chapter devoted to each principle where we talk about the feminist theory that underlies that particular principle and then illustrate how it can be applied to data science through a lot of examples. But I mentioned before data feminism, it came out in 2020, and these principles were formulated before this most recent wave of AI hype and Gen AI. And this, I think, has brought even more considerations to the conversation. And I'll get to an increasing number of these sort of as I move forward in the talk. But when we talk about data feminism, we still think that this is important because it calls back to the idea that AI and algorithms, large language models, things like this, they're ultimately all powered by data. And many of the biases and inequalities that we see these models reproducing are still very much anchored in what we call like data problems. So what I want to talk about here are two specific kinds of data problems. One is missing data, and the other is biased data. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how they take shape in data feminism, and then how they've sort of evolved to acquire and sort of accumulate additional downstream effects in this new AI landscape. So, you can see some of these downstream effects. For example, like when you talk about now we have this discourse in terms of algorithmic fairness about whether you're optimizing for what's called like fair treatment or fair outcomes, meaning like, do you want to make sure that everything going into the model is treated the same, which might lead to disparate output? Or do you want to make sure that, you sort of reweight the model such that everyone in the end is getting that there's sort of a fair outcome in the end. You're sort of accounting for some sort of upstream biases in the modeling process itself. But regardless of what you do, most of these models still exhibit significant biases. This is what's known as like an impossibility theorem. Like there's no way to solve this problem because they all have the same source, which is this biased data. And this connects back to this problem of unequal power that begins the book. So in data feminism, we use the example of this artwork that you're looking at here, the Library of Missing Data Sets. It's created by an artist and educator named Mimi Onwoha. And it's aimed at getting at this issue of biased data. And she makes the point in two ways. So the first is as a GitHub repository, which is what you see on the right. This sort of lists the data sets that you would expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need. But in reality, they don't. So on the website, you can it actually exists as this GitHub repository. You can create a pull request for a data set that you think should be there. Something like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime. There's sort of no national comprehensive tracking database on this. People excluded from public housing because of criminal records. This artwork, it's like a pre-COVID artwork, but I think the ways that political power impacted the collection of accurate COVID data really alerted all of us to how power really influences and really in many ways overdetermines data collection efforts. But there's a whole second way to encounter this piece, which is as a physical artwork, and that's what you're seeing over here on the left. Here, the data sets are labels on these file folders. You identify a data set that seems interesting to you or important, and you go to find out more, you open the folder, but then you find out that it's empty. So here the data sets are physically missing. And the point that Onwoha is trying to make in this piece is that these data sets, they're missing for a reason. And the reason is this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So like, who has this power, right? Generally speaking, it's governments, it's sort of moneyed institutions, the big five tech companies. And generally speaking, again, minoritized groups do not have the ability to collect this data. And so this is why a feminist approach to data, as well as AI, needs to begin with an analysis of power. Because far too often the data sets that we can access, and in turn the models that they're used to train, and then in terms of the research questions that we can ask using those models, as well as their real world applications. So it just sort of accumulates and accumulates. All of these have already been overdetermined by this imbalance of power in the world. And if you don't account for it up front, you will find yourself having to contend with it far too late. So Another really profound case of missing data sets is the example of feminicide. And so feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include both cis and trans women, and they're legally defined as crimes in a handful of countries, including Mexico. But the issue is that the state does not systematically collect data on feminicide. And so in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero. She's a Mexican citizen who resolved to head straight towards this problem of missing data and collect it herself. And so what she has done over the past, at this point, nearly decade, is single-handedly compile the largest public archive of feminicides in Mexico. She spends 2 to 4 hours per day logging them on a Google map that she culls from media reports. And she's helped families locate loved ones. She's provided this data to journalists and to NGOs. Ironically, she's been called into the Mexican Congress to testify on this issue in the absence of data that the Congress itself has not overseen being collected. And so this is a form of what might be called feminist counter data. So this is activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And it represents one way to use data to challenge power. It's not the only solution, and collecting more data has a lot of caveats that we can talk about later, but it's one way in some contexts to try to sort of push back against these larger forces of power. So we've seen another facet of missing data play out very visibly in training data for large language models. So these are the models that drive apps like ChatGPT. And so what we know about the training data, aside from it being large, is that it comes from the internet. And the internet is many things, but one thing it is not is a full and equal representation of the world. So it skews very young, it skews very male, it skews towards the United States, and it also skews towards toxicity. And it's certainly not the source of truth that some people interpret the output of things like ChatGPT to provide. Now, another thing we know is that the people putting together the training data for these large language models, they also know this, which is why people were so frustrated when the paper released with GPT-4 explicitly did not disclose the data sets that it had been trained on. And even now, we've seen efforts like Hugging Face's Bloom model. We just saw AI2, the Allen AI Institute, release their own fully documented large language model. Stanford maintains something that they're calling the Foundation Model Transparency Index. These are all really welcome. But until our world is free from bias, our data sets will not be. And so we will continue to need theories like feminism that help us understand how these biases work in the world. First, so that we can account for them, and then ideally how we can challenge and change them. And I actually have been peripherally involved with a project that's looking at some work on the C4 dataset. This is one of the bigger datasets that goes into training models like GPT-4. And one of the interesting things is that it pulls from a lot of personal web pages. And so if you want to look up this paper that is first authored by Lucy Lee, you can see some really interesting work that she has done to show how there's a really interesting and unexpected distribution of types of people and professions that are represented even in the purportedly, random sample of the internet that Common Crawl contains. But I want to turn to another sector now where algorithms are being deployed everywhere. And so this is sort of the shift between what some people like to now sort of delineate between, which is generative AI like ChatGPT, and then predictive AI. So sort of like modeling based on past data in order to produce some sort of outcome or score or a predictor of future something. And a place where this type of predictive modeling is taking place or is being deployed everywhere is the housing sector. And many of these products are powered by, AI, which of course is like, we know it's like machine learning. There's more specific than that, but now it's just labeled as AI. So you could think of like credit scoring algorithms, remote property management dashboards, biometric access for tenants into buildings, all sorts of things. And some of the work that Catherine has been doing recently is working with urban studies scholars to look at tenant screening services. These are essentially background checks that landlords can run on tenants before they decide whether or not they're issued a lease. And it sounds harmless enough, but in fact, they pull from eviction records and arrest records, which are two sources of data that are both extremely racialized in the context of the United States and also extremely low quality. Um, and so just as an example, if you look at evictions records, they do not distinguish between whether or not you had an eviction levied against you or whether you were actually evicted from your home. So they treat all of the same. So if you had a terrible landlord who filed to evict you and you went to court and say, like, actually, I did it, I paid my rent, I don't need to be evicted, and the eviction case is dismissed, that's still lodged as a record that would surface on your tenant screening report and likely prevent future landlords from renting to you. And the evidence against this data, it's so egregious that multiple parties have proposed a federal moratorium on these technologies in the same way that moratoria have been proposed against facial recognition software, which we'll get to in a minute, because the data that is being sort of held up as the source of objective decisions is so fundamentally impacted by these sort of power imbalances in the world. And I just sort of want to back up a little bit and make a bigger point about what it would mean to examine power in the housing sector. And so, one of the things that you can see is that there's this increasingly dizzying array of this, it's called prop tech, property technology, that helps landlords do all sorts of things, screen tenants, monitor them, surveil them, control their access. But you can really ask a simple question about this, like, why do landlords have so much more data and algorithms and AI on their side? Landlords can know almost everything about tenants. Whereas tenants can know very, very little about their landlords, like their history of evicting people unfairly or not fixing broken things on the property. So it's an interesting thought experiment that could very well be a reality if you ask, like, where are the technologies and prediction systems that help tenants build power, right? Why are we not building those things? And again, this comes back to these questions of resources, attention, time, and money. So challenging power in the context of housing data would mean stopping the use of these discriminatory technologies and designing technologies that help tenants rather than landlords aggregate power. So, sort of a broader question. How can we work towards a world in which AI systems are designed to rebalance unequal power rather than exacerbate it, sort of at a higher level? And one possibility comes to us from fields like HCI and design, which actually have very long track records of research around public process, around participation, and things like co-design. And in data feminism, we characterize these approaches as embracing pluralism. This just means listening and learning from a range of sources of knowledge. And interestingly, we've started to see some of these practices of co-design start to show up in data science and in data-driven research. And so I want to talk a little bit more about what that means and what it could look like in the context of AI research and regulation. So what this means is essentially taking power into account in the design process and centering the experiences of people at the edges and the margins first and foremost. So essentially making design decisions from the outside in. And now I'm going to turn to actually another project of Catherine's. It's too bad she couldn't be here today, but she's otherwise unavailable. But this is a project of hers that really tries to inhabit this principle. So this is a participatory AI project, but also a qualitative research project, and also just a community of practice that she's been working on since 2019. It's called Data Against Feminicide, and it has a couple of co-leads, including Catherine, as well as Isadora Cruikshank, Silvana Fumega, Elena Suarez-Val. And it was actually really inspired by the work of Maria Salguero, which I talked about earlier, to produce data about feminicide. And what Catherine and her collaborators sought to do was to understand how widespread that form of data activism was across North and South and Central America, The answer is like, it's actually incredibly widespread. Maria Salguero is by no means the only person doing this work. And then secondarily, the goal was to initially at least build AI systems and digital tools to try to support these human rights activists and advocates. And one of the things that Catherine was really trying to take seriously in the work was this commitment to embracing pluralism. And so in this particular case, it meant prioritizing listening to the activists themselves and learning from them about the tools that they needed. Um, and so I just sort of want to underscore the different stages of what this design process looks like and how it's a little bit different from the sort of standard approach to tool building that dominates HCI and computer science and data visualization research. So building a tool was not a foregone conclusion. The first question was like, should we build anything at all, right? And Catherine and her team worked in brainstorming workshops to discuss whether digital tools could help streamline the activists' work or reduce the emotional toll of this work for them. And it was a really iterative process. It took 3 years. And the result is that some tools were built that are actually being used by more than 40 human rights monitoring groups. And notably, they engaged these groups in these participatory sessions at very early stages at the project, as well as later on in data annotation to train the models, as well as for tool evaluation. So at every step of the way, expert knowledge and domain expertise was being incorporated into the process. And so actually, we can sort of point to other examples across the machine learning and even the AI space of different aspects of this being brought into design processes in really generative ways. So in data feminism, we talk about a project or a series of projects led by Desmond Patton at the SAFE Lab, which is now at Penn, which is a group that is broadly invested in reducing gang-initiated violence among youth, and they do a lot of social media tagging and classification in order to try to identify potential issues. And one of the things that they do very publicly and very intentionally, Patton has a background in social work, is to bring in kids themselves to help tell the scholars what the tweets mean, like what the language means. Another example that's really interesting is from Maria Antoniak in the context of maternal health. And it was another participatory design process and sort of brainstorming session that talked to expectant parents who were going to give birth about what they might want an AI-assisted chatbot to be for them. What kinds of things would they want it to provide? What ways could it be helpful in this otherwise isolating or unfamiliar experience? And very crucially, like what ways would they not want this chatbot showing up in their lives, giving them potentially false information? You can track down both of those papers as well. In any case, I want to just come back to this project for a really interesting conclusion that's a little bit to the side of the point here, but I think it's just a fascinating one. One of the things that Catherine learned from this project was that the feminicide groups did not want to fully automate their work. And this was because the activists considered their work to be a form of care work. They really felt that their work with the data, including the time that they spent with it, was an act of stewarding the memories of these women who were killed, of refusing to let them be forgotten by the state or in the media. And they didn't want to delegate that task to any sort of AI assistant, nor did they want it to move any faster than it already did. Where AI became useful was in reducing some of the sort of the time constraints of the process. So reducing the articles about other forms of violence that they saw while searching for feminicide and allowing them to focus their efforts on this memory work. So this brings us, actually it doesn't bring us, I sort of went to the side. So I'm just going to transition abruptly to another principle of data feminism, which has to do with the importance of actually it kind of does it because okay, so it has to do with this idea of rethinking binary and hierarchies, but I actually am going to talk about it in the context of emotional labor and emotion and embodiment more broadly. But to do that, I do sort of need to detour back into feminist theory land. Um, so if you've been paying attention, you've noticed most of the previous examples have focused on the issue of power and people, right? So sort of people who have power and then people who don't. But another major idea that comes from feminism relates to more conceptual structures of power, and more specifically, binary structures that are defined by this hard distinction between two groups. And so what feminist theory has helped to show is how binary distinctions are almost always hiding a hierarchy with one group on top and the other on the bottom. So the gender binary is the most obvious example of this, with the idea of man and the idea of woman. Um, but not only that, we know it's a false binary because we know that there are more than two genders. But interestingly, and this is something that actually personally sort of took me a while to see, once you see the hierarchy, you start to understand why that hard line between the groups is there in the first place. And it's there as an enforcement mechanism, right? It's there in order to preserve the power of the group on the top and to ensure that the group on the bottom isn't able to sort of like sneak up into the top and claim some of that power. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this sort of formal model of the gender binary and its dismantling and use it to question and dismantle other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So, um, you know, you could think of like nature and culture, which is the canonical feminist science and technology studies critique. It's why feminists really love cyborg. You could think of the binary relation between students and teachers, which is why feminist pedagogy often involves a flattening of that relationship. You could think of the distinction between reason and emotion, for example, that would lead us to value technical work, accuracy, precision, speed, these sort of epistemic virtues of AI and computer science right now, over emotional labor, which is personal, which is time intensive, which involves feelings. But I actually want to take this even further and even more into abstraction by thinking about how we can use this critique of false binaries and unequal hierarchies to help us cut through what's sort of in shorthand referred to as like AI hype, right? This is the simultaneously belief that AI is good because it's rational and objective, unlike sort of deeply emotional and subjective humans, but that also it's somehow simultaneously, so at the same time, so magical and mysterious that people can't even explain how it works. And I really see this like as a power move, right? It's a protective one. Um, the thing is, these big tech companies, they want us to believe in the magical superhuman capabilities of their AI systems because if they're too mysterious or too complicated for us lowly humans to understand, then they're left off the hook for the actual problems that these systems are causing in the world right now. Which, if you stop to think about it, like actually have very clear and direct sources, like sexism or like racism. Um, so like in the diagram, this is a diagram on the left of the transformer architecture from Attention is All You Need. This is the famous paper that sort of like launched the underlying mechanism that enabled large language models to be trained. So it's like you look over here, these little pink things, those are the inputs. Um, those are more accurately described as these like racist, sexist inputs that come from the internet. These are the reason why these output probabilities, you see, oh, actually here they are up there. Over there, at the top right, this is the reason why like the output probabilities are more likely to predict like a he pronoun when describing a doctor or a she pronoun when describing a nurse. There's all sorts of studies. And in fact, this is sort of becoming its own genre, this like documenting of all these different forms of biases that derive from the fact that these models are trained to produce the most likely outcome, and the most likely outcome that comes from internet data is the outcome that adheres to stereotypes. Or another example, there's this intense resistance of tech companies like Amazon to believe that like, their accurate and objective facial recognition models, like the ones that they've sold to police departments on these claims, would not then be used to further the racial inequality already embedded in the policing system in the United States. You know, it's like there's so many expected outcomes that we could predict instead of just putting biased data into these models. And instead, when we view them as having this aura of objectivity, the people who are designing them aren't really required to account for these potentialities as they unleash them onto the world. So here I'm just going to close, or sort of bring myself to a close, by following folks like Ruha Benjamin, who talks a lot about the default settings for AI systems. The default settings for AI are to accelerate and exacerbate racism, sexism, colonialism, and more. The default settings for AI will concentrate power in the hands of the already powerful. If you come back to the example of the landlords and tenants, to throw technological heft behind the landlords and leave tenants out in the cold. But we don't have to accept those default settings, right? And so this is sort of what is going to bring me to the final point that I want to make, which is, I hope, by now obvious, it's that AI needs data feminism and more, right? If like in 2018 and 2019, when we were writing the book, we saw these early signs of the power of data and the release of apps like ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion. Actually, rather, we saw these early signs, but now we have these apps like ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion. And what they've really shown the world, is what happens when the power of data accrues in the hands of big tech, with no decisions about how to design or deploy or even regulate their systems. None of these decisions are being made by anyone but themselves. Everyone else, including governments, are racing to catch up. And so, just sort of looking back, what we wrote in Data Feminism about the centrality of power, it's really depressingly prescient. Um, I was going to say but I actually also mean because the growth of these models and their compute requirements have brought additional considerations to the fore. So for one, there are the environmental costs of training these systems, which take weeks and months on the most powerful computing clusters. And there's some great folks already working in this space to try to get some transparency and documentation around the electrical and other sort of water requirements of some of these to train these models. We need so many more climate scientists and environmental studies scholars working to gain more information about this. Then there are the human costs, right? We've known for several years about the role that Amazon has played in cloud storage for ice, and how Google developed technology to make drone strikes more accurate, which they then sold to the US government. And now we see this technology actually being deployed in Gaza, right? And we see tech research groups like DARE and publications like Logic Magazine. They're reminding us once again, really powerfully, and I encourage you to take a look at some of their statements on these close connections between AI technology and the war in Palestine. And they remind us about how the ultimate use case for so many of these innovations that are really intended, or at least purported to benefit humanity, is literally the destruction of humanity instead. But I'm going to try to end on a note of hope. So these new AI systems, they're incredibly powerful. I've said this a lot of times today, but they're only as powerful as the data on which they're trained, the conditions under which they're developed, and the context in which they're put to use. And if we are going to imagine an alternative set of conditions for their development and an alternative set of contexts, so these are contexts that might empower rather than disempower, then it's feminism, intersectional feminism, anti-colonial feminism in partnership with indigenous feminisms. These all have very clear roles to play. It's an interventionist role. It's a political one, right? And I think that makes some people uncomfortable. But it's a role that necessarily needs to challenge these default settings of data sets and their resulting models, predictions, algorithms, because ultimately what I'm hopeful about is that we might have technology that works towards liberation and not just wealth extraction. So I'm going to end here. I realize that was kind of a lot and a little heavy at the end. And, I guess some things that we didn't yet have to contend with in writing the book, but I'm interested in hearing your questions and your ideas and your responses. Um, Here's some information just how to be in touch with both Catherine and me via email, Twitter, Blue Sky, GitHub, Instagram, all of these things. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Lauren. That was amazing. A lot of clapping happening over here. If you want to chat your question, that's fine. There aren't any questions in the chat currently, so feel free to put them in, but you can also raise your hand to speak up if you like. I'll start by asking what you say to those who make the argument that co-design takes too much time. We can't go fast enough.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think I sort of have two answers. So one is the pragmatic one, which is like there's always room for a little co-design, right? You never need to go quite as quickly as you think you do. And it is very often the case that taking a little bit more time or thinking strategically about how you can invite people in. And this is true for not just like sort of corporate or even sort of small company projects but for academic projects as well. Like we too are under time constraint, right? But I think that if this is a principle that you commit yourself to, you can think strategically about the best way or the best place in the process to involve participation in ways that will have the maximum impact. But more broadly and more conceptually, I think we do need to think a little bit about why we are so acculturated to do things so quickly, especially when the end result is, most of the time, due to a lack of participatory processes, a product that people don't really need. And again, this is true in startup land and corporate culture, as well as in academic work, where the model in so many fields is to produce a tool for a specific reason or a specific user group, and you test it and you document it, and then you're done. And then the tool is never used again. This is ultimately a big waste of resources when moving more slowly and thinking more holistically, or bringing in the particular community or interest group or population that you're interested in working with and saying like, what would really help you will ultimately lead to a tool that's more widely adopted in the more long term. Overall. And so I think, I've been increasingly thinking about Lorraine Daston and Peter Galliston's sort of elevation of the idea of the epistemic virtue and how this relates to computer science, because I think this idea that there's certain qualities, like speed, like efficiency, like objectivity, that are not just, that are sort of presumed to be the best way to do things, that end up over determining and influencing the shape of a lot of research. I think we need to ask ourselves, like, why are those the principles that guide our work and why not others? And what value judgments might be overlaid into those terms that we might want to push back against?
Thank you. Do we have other questions?
Yeah, Jennifer, I have a question. Hey, Laura, this is Molly Webb. I'm on Jennifer's team here at WashU. I really appreciated the point that you mentioned kind of early on about the entities that are sometimes creating this data that is out there publicly. I'm thinking specifically of local governments, so your county, your city governments. And I know a lot of the folks that are putting the data out there are just, regular people that are taking, say, tax records and then, translating them to be released publicly. And I would just ask, what is the little person to do here? If you're just responsible with making the data public, what can we do to make sure that we're making clear the biases or any other limitations of the data that's getting put out there by smaller government agencies?
Yeah, I really hear that. And I think that this is a real problem, or I mean, not a problem, it's an issue, right, that we need to contend with. It's that many city agencies and public agencies are compelled by sometimes uh, ethically and intellectually, but other times legally by open data laws, right? And required to put data out there. And yet these are the same agencies, because they're public, that don't have the funding to do full documentation, full contextualization, to ensure that the use cases for these data sets are circumcised, or at least they're signaled to people who would otherwise use them. Like a lot of the issue with the tenant screening services actually emerges from a lot of public records data, because it is city agencies that are like, we need to make this public, we'll put it online. They do not have the capacity to clean it, to annotate it, and so on. I mean, I think two things. So in an ideal world, there would be funding, resources, people to sort of enable best practices around both documentation of data sets, like sort of the data sheet model. There are others sort of producing a field guide for how you describe what the data set contains, what it omits, and where errors might be introduced because of the ways in which the data has been recorded. But I think that the flip side of that has a lot to, and then I think there's also protections that need to be put in place about corporate use of these data sets, which I think some cities and states are better at this than others, and there's definitely not sort of universal adoption on this, but we're increasingly seeing like public records just being used against people, you oftentimes sold right back at them for discriminatory purposes. But I think that there is more that we can do. Like the little person, I think, has to do with both data literacy, so making people realize that when they go to get a data set, as long as their intent is not nefarious, that they are thinking through these questions, right? Like, what am I actually looking at? And that takes place in high school, college, grad school classes. And then I've also seen some really interesting sort of DIY approaches to data set documentation. Like in the book, we have the example of, I think it's the Feminindex, but it's someone who releases a spreadsheet of all the data that she's compiled about gender-based violence around the world. And like the first tab just says like caveat emptor. It has like an all caps notification. You need to make sure that before you use this to draw conclusions, you ground truth your claims in broader contextualization and research. So I'm not sure if that was a satisfying answer, but I don't know if it's helpful just to hear that that problem is very real, and it owes its source to a lot of structural issues that are real challenges.
Yeah, that is helpful, Lauren. Thank you so much. And I apologize, I called you Laura earlier, but Lauren, just correcting myself. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have a question about recommended podcasts that delve into these issues that you're describing.
Oh, good question. So there's a really fun podcast that with a definite feminist inflection called The Good Robot, which is done by two recent PhDs out of University of Cambridge. And they actually just are in the process of releasing a book that documents some of the podcasts that they've had on their show. And I really like that one. If you listen to Paris Marx, like he generally has like a good sort of lefty anti-capitalist view on a lot of like a lot of sort of big picture issues relating to AI. So has had sort of on the one hand, like Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell, who wrote that stochastic parrots paper, but having them talk in a sort of high level way about what the issues are, as well as people like Naomi Klein talking about her doppelgangers book about conspiracy theories and sort of the collapse of the internet. And the future of democracy. So I really like his podcast as well. You know, the one that the one that I have not listened to yet, embarrassingly, this is being recorded, so delete this part. But the journal Critical AI, which just launched from Duke, which is an academic journal that's trying to really center humanistic approaches to AI in terms of scholarship, but has like a parallel podcast called Mystery Hype Theater 3000, which is run by some of the stochastic parrots people. And maybe people in the chat who have listened to it can tell us if it's good or not, but they definitely get good guests and they take on really state of the moment issues. And so I've definitely, they're all like bookmarked in my podcasts as to listen to later. I've just been so busy.
Okay, now we have a question. You mentioned documenting bias of AI as becoming its own genre. Do you have an example of a project research documenting AI bias?
Oh, sure. I mean, what I would say is you should go to the ACM Digital Library, which everyone has institutional access to, and just search on like LLM and then bias, and you'll see like every possible type of bias. Well, maybe not every possible, but like there's definitely increasingly a set of methods that involve either like prompting large language, like a ChatGPT type interface, either or through the API to give, like to fill in the blank and see, if you give it a name, what you think the profession is. If you give it a profession, think what the name is. To swap out religions, I've seen examples of anti-Muslim bias. I've seen certainly many examples of gender bias. I've seen language bias. There's a lot of work being done. And on the one hand, it is good to document these biases. I'm glad that there's increasingly sort of a standard experimental setup or sort of set of setups that we can especially point students to when they are interested in pursuing a particular kind of thing. On the other hand, I'm increasingly frustrated that the conclusion of the papers are always like, here we go, we documented it. Here's a number that shows how prevalent it is. And people are not talking about the fact that these same language models are being incorporated into all sorts of recommendation engines, into Microsoft tools, into search results, and these sort of like chatty agents are mostly reproducing and sometimes subtly reproducing these biases that are very much known to exist. And so that is the more distressing outcome of this kind of work, is that I haven't really seen a lot of work that tries to say like, so what do we do now?
Okay, Stephanie, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So I am a undergraduate student at WashU, and one of the things that is often said with regards to data analysis is to use data sets that are generally regarded as trustworthy, things like publicly available data sets from the FBI, places that are generally more likely to be biased than data sets you would find on like the Library of Missing Data Sets. And my question for you is, do you see a potential change in the future with regards to what data sets are considered to be reliable and trustworthy, and which data sets people are pointed to use as their starting point for data analysis?
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you for asking that. So, it's a really good question, because I think sort of like the big picture answer to your question is a little bit complicated, because the requirements for data to teach students to use these new methods with are getting larger and larger and larger. And as they get larger, the options for interesting, ethical, meaningful data sets are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so that's like a very real problem that like I face as someone who teaches like an NLP for a data science class in my own class right now. And then the flip side to this is, it is always true that you can learn the most about a data set and I think not just about the data set, but also just about how data works when you look at a data set that you understand intimately. And so I think that there's also a role, and there should be an increasing role, for data sets that students know a lot about. Like, I've done work in my classes that makes students find a data set that comes from Emory and then use their local knowledge, their domain expertise, to try to look at sort of what they know it captures and what they know it leaves out. Like, I had a really interesting project that looked at the database of leadership of student groups, because you can look up, like you can like email every single president of every single student group at Emory. And they were trying to look at questions of like gender representation, but then also which student groups were not even included in the data set, and why people might want to be the president or not of a student group in the first place. Same things with like who showed up at the career fair versus there's like a diversity career fair versus the regular career fair. And I had students say like, what's up with that diversity career fair? Like, why do companies want to go to that one? Is that because they have better diversity or because they have worse diversity? And do I really want to work there if that's the case? And so I think that there is like sort of a role for that. And I wish that there were more courses that acknowledge the value that comes from really scrutinizing data. I don't really have a answer for you, your question directly, except to say that I think that you're entitled to push back a little bit, especially as the scale, the sort of the range of scale of teaching data sets gets stretched. And the difference between, like, it used to be that like having a data set with like 10,000 or 100,000 observations versus 1,000 would either qualify or disqualify that data set for a particular exercise. But now it's like, does it have like millions versus thousands, or millions versus hundreds of thousands, right? And I think as that scale gets stretched out, you may be able to go back to your professor, especially if they're nice and understanding, and say like, hey, I'm actually more interested in this other data set that might be a little bit smaller, or might be a little bit messier, or that I might know a little bit more about, and I'd like to use that instead. And if the professor, I think, has any ability to recognize that rationale, they would probably say yes, I would hope.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Do we have another question? If not, I can ask the final question. I think we might have time for one more, and I am willing not to ask mine. So please feel free, audience, lovely participants, to ask yours. Okay, then. Oh, there we go. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming to WashU. This is so exciting. I read like a bunch of your stuff in grad school, so this is like, wow, you're a celebrity. This is maybe not a fair question, but you talked a lot about how we need to like think beyond binaries, and like the world's always more complicated than our binaristic understanding affords, and in fact like benefits power. How can we do that using like binary computing? Is that a complication? Do you see that as a complication?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know, it's so funny. I was just talking to a group of students at the New School yesterday who are actually, for this exact reason, looking to quantum computing to try to come up with sort of richer representations for multivariate analysis, for this same reason. You know, I think a bunch of things. I mean, I think many of the methods that we have to manipulate data do involve a binary assessment. Like, is this a thing? Is this not a thing? Or, you know, like, if yes, do this thing. If not, do this other thing. And we aren't necessarily going to be able to change those approaches. However, I think we can do a couple of things to sort of compensate. So one, most obviously, is like think about other approaches that allow for a combination of variables, decision trees, things like this. But I think more broadly, we can look at the results that might be rejected in some sort of like standard assessment of what's most statistically significant or what's closest to the mean or something like this, and say like, what do we learn from the edge cases, from the outliers, from the things that break the model? Because those examples are the ones that in sort of like mainstream data science, they don't like them because they make things messy and the explanatory power is reduced. But in a humanities context and also in the real world, those are often the examples that we learn the most from, because they tell us how these systems and these models and these algorithms are not working. And either like they point to the fact that they are not working for certain scenarios or groups of people, or they suggest ways in which they might be recalibrated to sort of account for other experiences or other forms of data. So I guess my answer is also not a binary, which is like both think critically about what you have as well as envision alternatives.
Thank you so much, Lauren. We are at the end of time, but it was so wonderful. And we'd love to hear you come back and talk about your forthcoming book when it's ready. So look out for us being in contact again. Yeah, so thank you very much. It was just really wonderful.
Thanks so much for having me. This was super fun. And you have my contact info, and please be in touch. And I hope to be in actual physical WashU in the future.
Yes.